Most people believe growth feels empowering, like confidence, like progress, like finally becoming who you were meant to be. But no one prepares you for the emotional cost of growth, because outgrowing people doesn't feel powerful. It feels heavy, it feels confusing, and it carries a kind of guilt that's hard to explain. You start questioning yourself in quiet moments, wondering if you changed too much, if you became distant, if moving forward slowly turned into leaving people behind. And the most unsettling part is this: nothing went wrong. No argument, no betrayal. You just grew. There's a quiet kind of pain nobody warns you about. It doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't explode into conflict. It arrives slowly, gently, almost invisibly. One day, you look around and feel something is different. The people who once felt like home still feel familiar, but the connection feels thinner, not broken, just stretched. Not because of a fight, not because of distance, not because of betrayal, but because something inside you changed. And the hardest part is realizing you didn't leave anyone behind intentionally. You didn't make a dramatic decision. You didn't choose separation. You simply kept growing. Outgrowing people doesn't feel like success. It doesn't feel like confidence. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like guilt. Guilt for changing. Guilt for wanting more. Guilt for no longer fitting into spaces that once felt safe. Because growth is supposed to be celebrated. That's what we're taught. Improve yourself. Move forward. Become better. But no one talks about what happens emotionally when you become someone new, while others stay connected to who you used to be. At first, the signs are barely noticeable. Conversations repeat themselves. Topics feel familiar, but no longer stimulating. The excitement you feel about the future doesn't receive the same energy in return. You notice yourself explaining less, sharing less, holding back parts of yourself that used to flow naturally. You begin editing yourself without realizing it, choosing words carefully, avoiding topics that matter to you, downplaying growth so it doesn't create tension, not because you think you're better, but because you don't want to create distance, and that's where the guilt quietly settles in. You start asking yourself difficult questions. Are you changing too much? Are you becoming someone unrecognizable? Is personal growth selfish? Here's the truth most people struggle to accept. Outgrowing others doesn't mean superiority. It means incompatibility with an old version of yourself. You're no longer the person the relationship was built around. And relationships don't always end with clarity. They don't always collapse dramatically. Most of the time they fade. You once bonded through shared struggles, shared limitations, shared survival. But now your inner world has expanded. You're solving problems instead of living inside them. You're asking deeper questions instead of repeating old narratives. And growth changes energy. Suddenly, you feel like the odd one out, even in rooms you've been in for years. So you start feeling responsible for the silence, responsible for the awkward pauses, responsible for the emotional distance you didn't choose. But growth doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for approval. It doesn't slow down for comfort. It simply happens, and still the guilt remains. Because growth doesn't only bring clarity, it brings awareness. You become aware of emotional patterns you once accepted. You notice cycles that once felt normal. You see behaviors you once excused but can no longer ignore. That awareness creates separation. Not immediately, not physically, emotionally. You're still present, still kind, still respectful. but you're no longer aligned, and despite everything, you miss them. Not just the people, but the version of yourself that existed with them, the version that didn't overthink, the version that didn't feel conflicted about wanting more, because growth always costs something. Sometimes it cost comfort, sometimes certainty, sometimes identity, and sometimes people. But growth is often romanticized. We're shown confidence, success, transformation. We're rarely shown the loneliness that follows growth. That's why you can be improving and still feel isolated. Why success can feel heavy instead of fulfilling. Why progress can trigger grief instead of joy. It's because growth separates before it connects. When you outgrow others, you enter an emotional space that feels undefined. You're no longer who you were, but you're not yet surrounded by people who reflect who you're becoming. So you float, and floating feels lonely. You don't fully belong in old conversations, but new connections haven't fully formed yet. And because you care deeply, because you remember shared history, you feel guilty for the distance. But here's something important to understand. Outgrowing others is not cruelty. It's a consequence of self-respect. When you choose honesty over comfort, growth over familiarity, awareness over avoidance, some relationships naturally lose alignment. Not because anyone is bad, but because the relationship was built for a version of you that no longer exists. You didn't decide to leave. You decided to stop leaving yourself behind. And that changes everything. Humans are wired for connection, for belonging. So when growth threatens familiarity, your nervous system reacts as if something is being lost. Even when your mind understands evolution, your body feels separation. That's why you second-guess yourself, why you consider shrinking back, why you think about slowing down to preserve peace. But peace that requires self-betrayal is not peace. It's emotional avoidance. Over time, the cost becomes visible. You feel drained after interactions that once energized you. You feel misunderstood even when communication exists. And eventually, guilt transforms into grief. You're not just losing people, you're grieving shared futures that will never happen, versions of connection that no longer exist. And invisible grief is the hardest kind, because nothing dramatic happened, no betrayal, no moment to point at, just growth. But staying the same to protect others eventually creates resentment. And resentment slowly erodes love. Growth doesn't mean erasing the past. It means honoring it without being trapped by it. Some people will feel left behind, not because you abandoned them, but because they chose familiarity over transformation. That doesn't make them wrong. It simply means your paths diverged. The guilt you feel isn't proof you're doing something wrong. It's proof that you're emotionally aware. But emotional awareness doesn't mean self-sacrifice. Sometimes people don't miss you. They miss access to the version of you that kept them comfortable. When that version disappears, discomfort emerges. But discomfort is not harm. It's an invitation to grow. Some will accept it, some won't. And that is not your responsibility to manage. Growth is not a competition. Your evolution doesn't reduce anyone else's worth. It simply reveals alignment or lack of it. Alignment matters more than history, because history alone cannot sustain connection. Only shared direction can. You can care deeply and still move forward. You can honor memories without forcing futures. You can love people without staying where you no longer belong. Because shrinking to keep others comfortable doesn't preserve relationships. It quietly erases you, and losing yourself is a far heavier loss than losing familiarity. So if you're carrying guilt right now, let this settle. You didn't change to hurt anyone. You changed to be honest with yourself. And that honesty deserves space. Growth will always change who walks beside you, but it will also bring you closer to who you truly are. And that is not something to feel guilty about. It's something to respect.